In this lesson, we'll show you how to drag items into the quantification workbook. When you're working with the quantification workbook, you can drag any item in your model, either from the scene or from the selection tree, into the quantification workbook. One thing to be aware of when you're dragging items to the workbook is that you want to drag them into the correct category. So looking at our current model, because we're dealing primarily with metal or steel beams, we're going to want to drag those items into the metals category under the items panel in the quantification workbook. So think carefully when you're beginning this process to make sure you put the items where they belong. So if we go to the selection tree and click on structural columns, we know they're made of steel. So if we left click and drag the structural columns into the quantification workbook, we'll put it over metals, and they'll automatically be added into the quantification workbook. You can immediately access all the information included in the quantification workbook about the items that you dragged in. So for instance, we can see right away that we have 30 W14 by 43 wide flange columns in level 1. You can also see all the properties of this column type in the upper right-hand pane inside the quantification workbook. Likewise, you can click through all of the other columns in the lower right-hand portion of the quantification workbook to see their properties too. Another way to add items to the workbook without explicitly dragging them is to use the right-click commands. So if we want to add the structural framing to the metals category, we can left-click on structural framing under the selection tree. Then we can left-click on metals under the quantification workbook. Now if we go back to the selection tree and right-click on structural framing, we can go down to quantification and select Take Off to Metals. As you can see, this added the structural framing that we selected, the wide flange W16 by 26 beams from level 2, directly into the quantification workbook under the metals category. Just like with the level 1 structural columns that we added first, we can see all the properties of all 49 pieces of structural framing. Let's do one more example, this time working from the scene. Let's say we want to add the concrete slab floor to the quantification workbook. Well, since it's concrete, we know it's going into the concrete category. So we'll left-click on concrete, right-click on the slab in the scene, and then go down to quantification and click Take Off to Concrete. Our floor has now been added to the quantification workbook.